on this Daily Devotional video today, I wanted to turn to what we call the Beatitudes. Also, it's often thought of as the Sermon on the Mount, which is a much longer portion of Matthew than the Beatitudes. But here I'm reading from the Beatitudes out of the Common English Bible, so it may sound a little different. Maybe you're used to hearing these as blessed are, and then a variety of different statements from Jesus. But the Common English Bible translates it to happy are. So I just want to share with you the first couple and then spend time with verse 4. Happy are people who are hopeless because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Happy are people who grieve because they will be made glad. Happy are people who are humble because they will inherit the earth. Happy are people who are hungry and thirsty for righteousness because they will be fed until they are full. Happy are people who show mercy because they will receive mercy. The Beatitudes continue from there with more reminders of how we achieve happiness. I wanted to spend time with verse 4, which says, happy are the people who grieve because they will be made glad. As I was preparing for this devotional, I was thinking about how the Beatitudes have been interpreted, for me at least. I've always heard them as kind of these opposites. That if I'm lacking mercy, then I'll be happy because I'll receive mercy. We heard that one here too, right? Or if I'm hungry, I'll be fed. But verse 4 says this. Happy are people who grieve because they will be made glad. So as I was preparing for this, I wrote this in my journal. In the Common English Bible, the phrasing is happy are people who grieve because they will be made glad. Thinking about it, how often do we think about the Beatitudes as opposites? But is the opposite of grief glad? Gladness isn't the absence of grief. We can feel grief. We can be in the midst of grief and still feel gladness. I've talked about this before, but the week following my dad's passing, we were still in this state of shock. It was unexpected. It was sudden. We spent time together grieving and weeping and in many ways just spending that time as community trying to come to grips with it. But there were absolute moments of gladness. There was gladness watching all the kids that had grown up together and now we're parents ourselves, now watching these grandkids run around and play. There was gladness. But there's still grief. Gladness isn't the absence of grief, but rather, and hear this, a protest against the grasp of grief. I'm going to read that again. Gladness isn't the absence of grief, but rather a protest against the grasp of grief. It's permission to tap into joy despite grief. I think that's an important thing for us to realize. It can feel when we're in the midst of grief that there is no relief from it. I've explained to people that for me, sometimes when I'm in the midst of grief, it feels as though I can't get a full breath. You know, that full breath that makes your whole body just feel like it's full of oxygen? I can't quite get that. My breathing remains shallow, and I just feel tired, like after running a mile. It's been a long time since I've done that. Can gladness really show up in the midst of that? It can. I've experienced it. My guess is you've experienced. Maybe we haven't named it, though. Because gladness shows up and we're sometimes so surprised by it that we don't want to scare it away. But what if instead of being afraid of scaring away, what if when it comes we welcome it and we say, this is my moment of protest against the grasp of grief? While grief is valuable, it's important, it is okay, it can be welcomed, and it is something that is healthy, it does not get to own us. It does not get to control us. When we let grief control us, what we are doing is we are saying, I can no longer feel gladness. I can no longer experience the ecstasy of joy. Because this ugly grasp of grief has brought me down and is holding me down, is weighing me down. So what if instead, when those moments of grief are there, we see gladness as our opportunity to say, for one moment I'm going to smile. For one moment, I'm not going to feel that shallow breath. I'm going to breathe in God's Holy Spirit and fill my body with goodness. Maybe you're going through grief right now, and this is exactly what you needed to hear. Permission to let gladness be a protest against the grasp of grief. Maybe you're not grieving right now. At least not in an acute way. But you will. And when you're not, you can practice gladness. And maybe even be gladness for someone else. What would it look like to share a moment of gladness with someone who's grieving? I was just listening to a podcast where they were talking about the value of written letters. How written letters can touch our souls and our minds in really meaningful ways. Written correspondence. So what if you were to write a letter to someone you know who is grieving right now? Maybe not just grieving a loss. Maybe they're grieving a change in life. Maybe they're grieving just the challenges of every day right now. Maybe they're grieving not being able to do something the way that they need to. We're probably all feeling that a little bit. How can you be gladness for someone else? Let me read these words from the Beatitudes again and remind us that in the midst of all these things, God reminds us that we can still be happy. Happy are people who are hopeless because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Happy are the people who grieve because they will be made glad. Happy are people who are humble because they will inherit the earth. Happy are people who are hungry and thirsty for righteousness because they will be fed until they are full. Happy are people who make peace because they will be called God's children. Happy, gladness.